Chapter 10 starts on page 349. This is where the course transitions away from general theory to how we apply auditing to specific settings. As we go through the chapter, you're going to know most of the material just needs to be reviewed and not necessarily memorized. The figure on page 350 is interesting, but I do not recommend you spend any time on this. On page 351, the accounting standards that relate to revenue are reviewed. This should be all familiar. I would never test you on that specifically. There are on the bottom of the page where it goes through specific fraud activities that you might be unaware of. Do read this and be able to discuss them. As we go through the chapter starting on page 352, we see the overview of the financial or the revenue process, the typical transactions, sample flow charts. This is very background information. I would review it once and not read it multiple times. The types of documents identified on page 355 goes through several documents. That list goes all the way to page 358. You should be able to understand who makes the document, why it's used, what would be the key attributes of the document. I wouldn't necessarily focus on memorizing the list of documents, but if I, for example, ask you what a remittance advice is, do you know what it is? Do you know who makes it? I wouldn't worry about the definition, but do you know it? On page 359, they start to review the key functions. Again, you can memorize this if you want to, but it's not really necessary because it's giving a general framework. Every specific case and example we use will be very detailed. The inherent risk assessment that begins on page 361 is again more background information to help make you aware, to teach you how to think about the process. When we do cases in class and examples, you'll see this more clearly illustrated. As we go through the control risk assessment, again, I would read it once to get a broad understanding. It's taking all the concepts, all those 5 factors from the COSO framework and showing you how it applies in this setting. It's giving a general setting, but we always test more specific. There's a great table on page 366, which goes through the assertions, possible misstatements, and control activities. You've probably seen things like this in matching exercises. You can't memorize it. There's just too much. But what you can do is review it and even make games or ways to interact in a group setting where you talk about how you could prevent occurrence from being violated, what type of control activities you'd see. The remainder of the next 5 or 6 pages from 367 really all the way to 373 goes through the assertions and why they're important. Again, this is taking just the general background which we should be very familiar and comfortable with and making it very specific to this setting. I would not memorize it. There's no new information here. As we go through, we see another great table on page 374, table 10.8 and 10.9. You don't need to memorize this. What you need to do is understand it. Does it intuitively make sense? If you were given this information in another setting, would you be able to do it? We go back to the discussion of assertions now from a substantive testing perspective for about another 5 or 6 pages, and that goes all the way to page 381. Now, where we do introduce new material is on page 381, where we start talking about confirmations. I would spend considerable time reading page 381 all the way to 386. In particular, I would pay attention to table 10-12. You should be able to, after reading this, identify the different types of confirmations, the advantages and disadvantages, the quality of evidence they yield. Confirmations are the only new concept. It will be where I would focus on from when I study this chapter. It actually completes the chapter. There's not a lot of new information. Have a great day.